Hello and welcome, everyone. Um, we are going to dive into this session called Exploring Portland's Lost Japantown via a digital story map today. My name is Alyssa Dingus, and I am the Director of Education and Engagement at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon. And I'm here today with Chisao Hata and Cynthia Basie, who are both going to introduce themselves to you all. Go ahead, Chisao.
Hi there. I'm Chisao Hata. I'm currently the creative director of the Living Arts program at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and happy to be here today.
Hello, and I'm Cynthia Basie, former staff member. I was the education manager for a while, and now I am a board member and volunteer at the museum. So thank you.
Yes, lovely to be here today with you both. So just to give you all an introduction to what we're going to do today in this session, we're going to briefly introduce you to a new tool called A Forgotten Community, a tour of Portland's lost Japanese American community, and talk a little bit about how and why this digital story map came to be. And then we're going to have the privilege of hearing Chisao and Cynthia talk a little bit more about a few of the sites that are on the story map and give us some additional context based on their extensive wealth of knowledge that they have. So this session was sort of framed around these two questions. The first question was, who gets to decide which histories are taught? And then how does that affect our collective knowledge of places and communities? And I think when people hear the phrase Oregon history, the things that come to mind are often Lewis and Clark, Manifest Destiny, Westward Expansion, the Oregon Trail, the pioneers. But that is one facet of a much longer and richer history. I wanted to point out that the Japanese American Museum of Oregon is situated in a part of downtown Portland that was once called Nihonmachi, and there was a thriving Japanese American community that was in this neighborhood. This map shows this neighborhood in about the year 1940. All of the businesses that are on this map were operated by Japanese Americans. And despite the existence of this very dense and tight-knit community within living memory, the history of Japanese Americans in Portland's Nihonmachi and across the state are largely absent from classroom instruction. And there are many adults who are wholly unaware of its existence. Brandon Shimoda, the writer, poet, and professor, shared in his keynote at the 2023 Minidoka Pilgrimage that the task of the present is to prevent the past from erasure. And that line really struck me and feels deeply connected to the mission of the story map that you all have created. So I wanted to pivot to how the story map come to be and why is it important? So Cynthia and Chisao, can you tell us a little bit about the story map?
So the Architectural Heritage Center, located here in Portland, Oregon, we wrote a grant together to the National Historic Preservation Trust Fund, and was awarded this grant to create the story map. The story map itself has been a tool that's been used by several different organizations. It has its pluses and it also has its minuses, but its pluses are particularly in this situation where the community is no longer in existence, as is Black Tulsa, that story. It really helps to bring back the history and highlight who the people were in the history there. So it was with that grant that we entered into this process of figuring out a year-long, how do we do it? What do we do? How do we identify sites? How do we organize it? And that is kind of the beginning of the story map project for us.
Okay, and I'll add too that along with what Chisawa said, the goal was to make visible a community of real people and their experiences and their successes and challenges, and to go beyond textbooks or quick online resources. The text was written, the images selected to show the diversity. We sought out family histories and photographs, news articles, historic maps, directories, government documents, and an aim was to introduce a history that was more complex and comprehensive. And going back to what Alyssa said, it's a history in our city, our state, our country that's worth recognizing and learning from. We've also, in the process, really worked to make the story map accessible to students and to a general audience. It's a good place to enter this history, and we're very excited about it.
Thank you. So I'm going to go ahead and pivot to showing you the story map itself. Alrighty. Hi, everyone. Sorry for the jump in time. It's me, Alyssa, from a different day. The visual for this portion of our presentation did not work properly in our first go through, so I'm re-recording just this section. So you can access our digital story map by visiting the QR code that's down here in the bottom right of the screen, or you can get there by going to our website, and I will show you that right now. Let me share my screen. Alrighty, so here we are on jamo.org, our website, and you can find the story map under the Education tab. It is the very first item that comes down in the drop-down menu. And if you scroll down just a smidgen, there's a big button that says Explore Story Map. And when you click on that, it will open up our digital story map. The story map begins with a brief introduction to the neighborhood and why the story map was created. And then those 20 sites that were selected from various parts of the Japanese American history in Portland were kind of lumped into 3 separate thematic categories: growth of a community, meeting new challenges, and a legacy that endures. The entire story map is a large scrollable website, so you can scroll through and see all 20 sites just by scrolling from the top and going down, or at any point you can always jump to a different time period by clicking on one of those other thematic categories at the top. The first thing that I wanted to point out is this map with a slider bar. This slider bar is a comparison of Japanese American sites from before World War II and then today. And so if you slide the slider bar all the way to the right, these are some of the 20 sites that were selected that are shown here on the map. And this map is movable. So a couple of them are not in this city center here, so you can't actually see all of them. And this is the pre-war highlighted sites. And if you slide the bar to the left, this is the modern day map with a couple of the remaining sites that are still around highlighted. And you can just very visually see how different things are today. As you scroll through those 20 sites, each one will begin with a map that shows you where in the neighborhood or where in Portland that location is. And then each one will also have a selection of photos and text that will explain each site in greater depth. The photos can all be opened further. And then some things like articles can be downloaded for you to read the full version of, because even if you open the full photo, it may not have the entirety of the text there. So as you go through, this is how you can access all of those 20 sites plus the primary sources that were used to build the story map. All right, I'm going to pause there and we're going to jump back over to our slideshow. So, as previously mentioned, our session today is going to introduce you to a handful of the sites that are highlighted in the story map, give you a little introduction, plus build on the text that's already available on the website because we couldn't fit everything in there. So the first site that we're going to get introduced to today is the Merchant Hotel. And Cynthia, what can you tell us about the Merchant Hotel?
Well, this beautiful building, the Merchant Hotel, opened in 1884, and the Oregonian newspaper praised it as Portland's finest. It was elegant and spacious. It had a hydraulic elevator and electric call bells. It had bathrooms on every floor and was conveniently located close to Union Station, the docks, downtown businesses. The owners sold it, though, in the late 1890s, at a time when Japanese immigrants were beginning to arrive in larger numbers in Portland. And the hotel eventually was managed by two Japanese men, and it became known as the Teikoku Hotel. The hotel's managers were commended in the Japanese newspaper, the Osho Nippo, for serving both Japanese and American customers. And the manager said, it's a good business model, good way to do business. This hotel in particular was considered the heart of Japantown at its peak. The block where the hotel was located offered services for people staying there. There was the Teikoku Company, which I think you can see in the photo there on the corner. Around the corner was a bathhouse and laundry. There was the newspaper, the Osho Nippo, also on the first floor. Upstairs was Dr. Tanaka, a physician that served the community. The hotels like this played a unique economic role in the community. There were services for the community, but also support for a family. By 1925, about 90% of the small hotels and lodging houses were operated by Japanese. In that map that Alyssa had shown you earlier, there were at least 28 small hotels and lodging houses by 1940. And clustered around each of those sites, you would find a general store, a grocery, barber, laundry, cafe. And these small hotels and lodging houses offered a place where new arrivals and workers coming into town could safely spend the night, but also where local workers could have a small room to call home. And there was a community there for support. So by managing a hotel, a person could support their family. They would have probably one room for sleeping, another one for kitchen, living space. And the management, repair, maintenance, and housekeeping duties fell to the family. The children then, when old enough, would also help out. Yoji Matsushima's family owned the Teikoku store, and they lived upstairs on the 4th floor. And he talked sometimes about how his mother and aunt cooked meals, lunch and dinner, for the family, for employees of the Teikoku store and the hotel, or anybody else who needed a meal that day. Younger children had safer spaces to play. Jean Matsumoto and her sister Alice talk about riding tricycles and upstairs in the hallway when the weather was bad, but also being able to play out front in a safe space. Canon Kitayama's family managed the Royal Palm Hotel, which is just about 2 blocks north on Flanders. And he described playing in the hotel's garage with other kids when there was space. They'd have tricycles and wagons and run around. Mr. Kitayama also talked about the diversity in the neighborhood, the Chinese families and their children who lived nearby. But he also talked about Union Station, which was a couple of blocks away. And there were many African American workers who worked as waiters and porters and brakemen and cooks. And his father kept a timetable so he would know when they were arriving. And his father would save a room for them. Well, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, when President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066 and General DeWitt issued exclusion orders, families were forced to leave their homes and their communities. And there's records from the Federal Reserve Bank that shows that the Teikoku Hotel sold to a Mr. Nordo in, I think it was in May of 1942. He put $500 down and agreed to pay $50 a month until the balance was paid off. So if you go downtown, you'll still see the Merchant Hotel. It's still standing and in use today.
Thank you, Cynthia. A fascinating history of that small but mighty place. Chisao, the next place that we are going to get introduced to is the Yamaguchi Hotel. What can you tell us about this place and its history?
Before I get into talking about the Yamaguchi, I also wanted to add some information that our communities were relegated to these areas, redlined to these areas because of laws at the time of where you could live and where you could not live. And along the West Coast, there was about 26 Nihon Machis, and I think today there may be only 4 left. So these places become not only historically important, but lessons of what we've learned from the past that we should not repeat again. The Yamaguchi hotel is important because the couple that ran the hotel, Shigezo and Masaya Yamaguchi, ran that hotel from 1921 to 1941. People in the Japanese American community understood and called it the Yamaguchi, but it was also known as the Neumeyer Hotel. And so eventually what happened is Masaya's husband, Shigeo, died around 1931, and she was left to manage the hotel. What's really significant about her, besides being a woman living during those times, is that she was a midwife, or what Japanese call sambas. And that history is an extremely important history because women of the time maybe had language barriers and they couldn't go to regular hospitals, or they weren't accessible to regular hospitals, were not accessible to them, particularly if they lived out in the country. And so the role of the midwife became extremely important. And we know that there is at least 2 sambas in Japantown, in Nihon Machi. And so the significance also is that that story impacts us today, because the Yamaguchi Hotel was the last remaining historic building on a block that just recently was demolished. And we have experienced this demolition by neglect, is what it's called, over and over again in this 10-block radius that was Nihon Machi. And we still work today to try to not only preserve the stories, but some of those buildings that still exist. And so that's part of our work that continues on with the Japanese American Museum, is to continue to tell those stories and to protect the buildings, and to work with other organizations like the Architectural Heritage Center, like Restore Oregon, to preserve those histories that are historic and important to the overall story of Portland, and particularly this Old Town historic area that is now known as Old Town, Chinatown, Japantown. And it is close to where the original port was. So many cultures landed in this area. the Greek, the Roma people, besides the Chinese and the Japanese and Filipinos. So the history of this is the history of Portland. And we also want to preserve and protect that history throughout the telling of the Yamaguchi Hotel. So you're going to see that on the road toward the demolition of the hotel, the museum and other organizations worked very hard to bring forward the history of Masai Yamaguchi and also the history of this area known as Nihon Machi. And we held a vigil right before the demolition of the building. There is some parts that were preserved, but we're not sure exactly how or if as a museum we'll be able to maintain that. So the stories are equally important in the telling of this as it lands in the story map process.
Thank you, Jisao. I feel like a takeaway for me from hearing both you and Cynthia talk about these two kind of hotels of many that were in the neighborhood, there's such an insight into the kind of community care approach. I think there were a lot of services and a lot of people working with people within the community to, ensure the health and wellness of those who were there. And I feel like Masai's story really speaks to me in that regard. Okay, we are now going to step out of the story map for just a moment to give some additional context to what comes next. So anti-Japanese racism began as soon as the first immigrants from Japan arrived and continued to escalate for decades. The bombing of Pearl Harbor served to ignite this kind of powder keg that had been building and was then used as justification for the United States to begin taking drastic measures to limit the civil rights and freedoms of Japanese Americans. As we step back into the story map, we're going to meet Min Yasui and hear about how he pushed back against these increasingly restrictive laws. Cynthia, can you tell us a bit about Min and his story?
Yes. Yeah, Min Yasui, he grew up in Hood River, Oregon. He attended the University of Oregon, graduated with a law degree. While he was at the university, he had been in the ROTC program, Reserve Officer Training Corps. And when he graduated, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Reserves. So after graduation, he couldn't find a suitable job in Oregon, so he worked for the Japanese consul in Chicago. But following the attack on Pearl Harbor, he quit his job, and he soon received orders to report for duty at the U.S. Army camp in Fort Vancouver, Washington. But when he reported for duty, he was rejected because he was Japanese American. Immediately after that attack, actually the day of, the Issei, the non-citizen immigrants, were reclassified as enemy aliens, and many were arrested, including Min Yasui's father, who was a prominent businessman in Hood River. These men were community leaders, and most had families. So with that order, their bank accounts were frozen. That meant that they couldn't withdraw money to buy groceries for their family or pay bills. If they had a business, they couldn't pay their employees. So Min Yasui saw what he needed to do, and he set up a law office in Nihon Machi's Foster Hotel, which is actually right across the street from the Merchant Hotel. But he wanted to help the Issei, help with the crisis they were facing, and also with the challenges that the next generation were facing. On March 23rd, 1942, Proclamation 3 was issued, and it placed a curfew on Italian, German, and Japanese immigrants, now aliens, and all people of Japanese ancestry in the Western states. So Min Yasui decided that the order discriminated against citizens based on their ancestry, and he chose to challenge it. So he violated the curfew. He was arrested and eventually found guilty of curfew violation. And he spent 9 months in solitary confinement in that jail cell that you see there on the screen. After his jail term, he was sent to Minidoka, the incarceration camp in Idaho, and was later released to join his mother and his sister in Denver, Colorado. So when he was there, he passed the bar exam and established a new law practice. But he continued to fight for civil rights in the community. He helped found the Urban League of Denver in 1946 and was later appointed to Denver's Commission on Community Relations. In 1976, he became a founding member of the JACL, that's Japanese American Citizens League, their Committee on Redress. And it was part of a national movement to investigate the World War II injustices and provide compensation for survivors of incarceration. Well, kind of fast forward almost a decade, we have President Reagan, who signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which granted redress of $20,000 and a formal apology to every person still living who had been incarcerated during World War II. But sadly, Mr. Yasui died in 1886, so he wasn't alive to see the results of their work. Well, almost 30 years later, President Obama posthumously awarded Mr. Yasui with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which sits in the actual jail cell. You can kind of see it back in the corner there. And the jail cell is now on permanent display at the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, downtown Portland. And a few years ago, 2017, the museum, Japanese American Museum of Oregon, and the Minoru Yasui Legacy Project began holding an annual student contest to encourage students to think about civil rights and democracy. And so they still hold that contest annually. It's a tribute to his legacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Cynthia touched a bit on this already, but I'm going to give some additional context before going to the next slide. So in February of 1942, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, which gave the military the right to remove people from any part of the country for military necessity, which was then used to justify the removal of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent from their homes, 2/3 of whom were American citizens. And after that, they were sent to temporary detention centers while the government built more permanent concentration camps in the interior of the United States. In Portland, the temporary detention center was called the Portland Assembly Center. And Chisao is going to tell us a little bit about that site.
So the Executive Order 9066 was issued in 3 locations in Portland, in Gresham, Southwest Portland, and Northeast Portland. And it's very significant that everyone had to register. I believe the men of the family probably went down to register. And what that meant was you were given a number. And so people changed from going by their names and needing to go by their numbers. And this is an important aspect of the incarceration process, which actually, if you study it more and understand how it relates to other situations like the Jewish situation in Europe, there was also a registration process. And so that's an indication that something else could happen. The military definitely took the lead on this and called it military necessity. and removed only the Japanese and Japanese Americans from the West Coast. So it impacted Washington, Oregon, and California, and particularly California. And so these almost 15 assembly centers, or locations that were to be a holding place for people while the concentration campsites were being built, was where people were taken first, not knowing where they were going, not knowing how long they were going to be there, not knowing where they would be going next, having to leave the life that they had known up until that point. Many of them were in their 50s and 60s at that point, having built up their life. The men, about 200 men, were immediately taken out of Nihon Machi in Portland and sent to Missoula, Montana. And I think that's another significant act of divide and conquer the community, so they could not be able to organize the community or communicate with each other. So this initial stage of the executive order was quite devastating to the community. It locked up all the businesses of Nihon Machi, and life changed completely for the people that were there. So, people had to decide right away what to leave, what to take, not knowing where they were going. And like Tanforan Memorial or Tanforan Racetrack and Santa Anita Racetrack, a lot of these centers were built in places that were former livestock holding centers. So the Portland Livestock Exposition Center was the first photograph that you saw. And the stalls that were built for people were built right on top of that. They didn't have separate facilities. There were shared sanitary facilities and eating facilities. And so it really began to chip away and affect the family life that had existed up until then. And as I talked about the Yamaguchi Hotel and its reference to not only what happened in the past, but what's happening today, this is also true of the Portland Assembly Center. The Portland Assembly Center is one of about 15 centers that is actually, I think it's about the only center that is still intact, or at least partially intact, from that historic time. And so we're moving to today. The Expo Center is now a 53-acre site that's being looked at in how can we preserve the cultural historic impacts of this land, and also have it be associated with a new direction, a new development for the center. In the case of the Portland Expo Center, they're looking at sports as a way to do that. Out there at the center, we had the dedication, don't remember the exact year, but you're seeing the picture of, it's called the Gate of Remembrance. And the artist, Valerie Otani, is speaking about the tags that are represented on this torii gate that hangs as you get off the TriMet light rail at the Expo Center. It's down right now for improvements, but it will be returned as we go through this 2-year process of looking at the Expo Center and how it's going to be uplifted, not just the Japanese American community, but also the African American community and the indigenous community. And it's also an area where, when you study the history more, when Japanese Americans left Minidoka and had nowhere to go, many of them returned to a city that was called Vanport. It was a constructed city between Vancouver and Portland, where it was originally designed to build ships for World War II. But Japanese American history is very prevalent in the Vanport history. So we still have events at the Expo Center, the Day of Remembrance, which is an annual event, and the Vanport Mosaic Festival, which lifts up the stories and the histories of people who lived in Vanport during that time. So the Portland Assembly Center really remains a place of history and of learning, and really of kind of dreaming what's possible for the future use of this place. There's so much that could be said, but we'll end it there.
Yeah, thank you, Chisao. So we're gonna kind of step out of the story map again briefly, because in the late summer and early fall of 1942, the people who had been living at the Portland Assembly Center were forcibly removed again, this time to these more permanent concentration camps that had been built in the interior of the country. Most people from the Portland area were sent to Minidoka, which is in southern Idaho. This is a piece of a panoramic photo of what the facilities at Minidoka looked like. It's a big drastic change from the climate and surroundings in Portland. And many people spent the duration of the war there, incarcerated there. The story map, however, does not go into detail about this portion of the story because it's focused on the stories of people and places of Portland. So our story map continues, picks back up again after the war. And the first place that we're going to get introduced to is the Nikkei Jinkai, which was important before and after the war. And Chisao is going to tell us a little bit about that place.
So the Nikkei Jinkai was located in Nihonmachi, and it was a fairly small space. It was also known as the Japanese Ancestral Society. Hang on a minute. It was, oh gosh. I just wanted to say, we have a certain amount of space that we had to write in the story map. And so this is just an introduction, right, to everything. And people can take a deeper dive into what exactly the whole history was, because it's just long and involved. But this organization was originally called the Japanese Deliberative Council of Oregon in 1907, and it was renamed to the Japanese Association of Oregon in 1911. And it became the place where Japanese organizations held their meetings, particularly like what was called kins, where the people, if you came from Hiroshima or Kurosawa, the group of people could meet and kind of reconnect, even if they didn't know each other in Japan. It would be a way to support each other and really find out like what resources were available in this area of Nihonmachi. So it was a way to share resources, to share stories, to share history. And so, around that area at that time, there, of course, were restaurants and barbers and different stores. But later, as time went on, the use of the Nikkei Jinkai Hall changed quite a bit, but it still remained a hall. And it was the main place where in the 1970s, where Cynthia talked about the redress movement, really began to take root in what was formerly Japantown. But the Nikkei Jinkai, just a big room with a couple of long tables, a very small office space, a bathroom in the back, is where all of the organizations at the time, the Japanese American organizations, met to talk about the significance and the strategies that were happening to address not only the education of the relocation, that the incarceration centers, but also the history that just hadn't been told to the generations like my generation of third generations. And so the Sansei really felt that it was important to lead this charge of looking at the history of why this story wasn't told and why it should be told. So this happened long before the passage of the bill in 1988. And there was many different kind of directions that people wanted to take or looked at possible directions. And so this still kind of continues to today, even though the Nikkei Jinkai Hall is not there as a specific gathering place. The churches, which acted as gathering places at the time, also no longer exist in in an area. There are several throughout Portland that still hold places where people can go to services. There's a hot lunch program. There's also a community picnic that's held every summer that brings people together very informally, but for a big potluck. And I think this last summer we had about, someone told me, about 500 people. So there's still a need to keep connecting to the history of what brought the Issei here, what developed the Japanese American community, and the stories we continue to tell at the Japanese American Museum.
Thank you, Chisao. And speaking of continuing on, I think our last site has one of my favorite stories of the story map, and this is Kern Park Flower Shop. And Cynthia is going to give us some insights into the very special story of this place and the people who work there.
Yeah, thank you. Kern Park, when it was started in 1950, it wasn't located in Nihonmachi, but it does represent the Japanese American community that were farmers and growers. They lived outside of the Portland metro area. So 1915, Sukiman, and that's the man that you can see in the picture there, and his wife, Shin, established their greenhouses in Portland's east side along Holgate Boulevard. And the business started out wholesale and expanded to retail sales after a while when they started growing carnations and chrysanthemums. The couple established their business, but they also established a relationship with the community in the area and in Portland. 2 years after the business's founding, 1917, they were recognized along with 22 other florists by the Portland Women's Club for their donations of plants and seeds for people in need in the country, in the city. Kern Park Flora was also a member of the Oregon Flower Growers Association. And in the fall of 1941, the organization leased a large building where they could operate a wholesale growers market. But sadly, the Atami family wouldn't be participating in that. In March 1942, it earlier talked about the curfew that was issued, Proclamation 3. In addition to the curfew that was placed on Japanese Americans, the curfew also set a 5-mile radius for how far people could travel from their home. So we were able to find in our research, documents where one of the sons had to request permission to travel to sell their products, their cabbage and tomato and lettuce plants. Just to do business, they needed special written permission from a government official to travel. Later, we found a document that was signed, a month or two later, showing a neighbor who agreed to take care of, to watch over the business, the greenhouses, after the family were removed. So 1942, like Alyssa and Chisawa talked about, when that order was issued that removed all people of Japanese ancestry from Northwest Oregon, they reported to the Portland Assembly Center and later were sent to Minidoka concentration camp in Idaho. And Shin, Tsukiman's wife, passed away when they were at Minidoka. The family returned in 1945, and they found their business vandalized, beyond repair. So much for the agreement with the neighbor who was going to watch over it. But you also notice in that photograph, there's the flag. It shows a service star flag and a star for each family member who was serving in the military. So he was very proud of his sons and son-in-law who were serving. Sadly, Tsukiman died shortly after the picture was taken, and his eldest son, Shigeo, and his wife, Fumi, who is seen in the picture there with their 2 children, restarted the business. Shigeo continued the family commitment to community by serving on a committee for the Oregon State Alien Land Law test case. And it was chaired by Daiichi Takioka, who was probably in that Nikkei Jinkai photograph somewhere in there, because he was very involved. The 1946 committee, they raised funds, public awareness, and support. And in 1949, the Oregon legislature overturned laws that forbidded Japanese-born immigrants from renting, owning, and living on land owned by a family member. They overturned that law. They were the first state in the country to do so. After the war, the anti-Japanese sentiment was still strong, and the family ended up hiring a white salesperson as they were trying to improve sales. A fire broke out in one of the greenhouses in 1957, and so they restarted the building just as a florist shop, no longer a greenhouse. Shigeo passed away in 1989, and Fumi continued to run the business with the help of her son. Yeah, so you can see in the picture here, this picture was taken this summer of 2022, and Fumi is sitting there next to her daughter, Holly. Holly took over the business in 2014 and renamed it Kern Park Flower Shop. It's still on Holgate, still doing business. It was just so much fun to go in during this project and meet with Holly and talk with her about the family and share information, but also to watch the customers who came in. They were so positive and so excited about the work that they were asking her to do, in maybe for a funeral or a special celebration of graduation. So it's still a business that's in operation. Holly works with her oldest daughter, Kimberly, and someday maybe even her grandchild. But the florist shop in Portland happens to be one of the longest running family operated businesses, family of Japanese ancestry. So very happy to have them part of our story map project.
Yeah, such a special story. And I know there's a couple of other businesses that have existed from before the war that are still around today, but are not in the neighborhood any longer, that are on the story map. Ota Tofu and Obukan Judo, I think, are both on there. All right. Well, coming into today, so following the redress process, the Japanese American Historical Plaza was built on the waterfront in downtown Portland as a permanent memorial to share and honor the history of Japanese Americans. It became clear after finishing the plaza, the two pictures here are, the one on the top left was shortly after it was finished, and the one on the bottom right is probably from a year or two ago. So you can see how much the trees have grown up over time. But after finishing the plaza, it became obvious that there was a need to create a museum space to further preserve the stories and the history and educate the community. And after that, the Oregon Nikkei Legacy Center, which has recently been renamed the Japanese American Museum of Oregon, came into being and recently moved into a brand new space in 2021, which you can see here in the photo. The museum is currently the only Japanese American organization that remains in what was once a densely populated Japanese American community, and the museum remains there to ensure the history and the stories of this place are not erased. The museum feels a very deep responsibility to ensure that this history is known, told, taught, and shared widely. I wanted to say thank you to both of you for introducing us to this very rich resource. I hope that all of you who are watching will take some time to check it out. This is just a glance into 6 of the 20 sites that are on the story map, and you'll have to do some further exploration on your own to learn about the other 14 that we didn't really talk about today. We would love to hear your feedback about the story map if you use it. Stay in touch with us, and please stop by the museum if you're ever in Portland. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.